So let me start with the biggest development that has happened, and I think it has changed a lot of things globally, India, and all businesses. I think so. At first, want to hear your views on the business that we all of you are involved in, wealth management, right? What has COVID meant to how this business has changed, altered? Firstly, in the last maybe 5-6 quarters, and the more lasting impact of this into the future. Maybe we can hear from all of you. Karan, if you want to just kick off, and then we can move on to Shrikant, Himanshu, all of you to kind of share your thoughts on this. Over to you, Karan.
Thank you. So maybe Naveen, I can start.
Yes, Karan.
Yeah. So no, I think from a COVID perspective, obviously, the best thing is that we've been blessed to be in an industry where I think things have gone on normal pretty much every day for the last 18 to 20 months. So I think in that sense, we are all fortunate. But I think 2-3 things have kind of helped the industry overall. I think an incremental amount of liquidity, especially due to the entire central banks' policies across the world, has obviously fueled the general savings environment with all our clients. And secondly, I think a low interest rate environment across the world, and even in India, you've seen a fairly benign interest rate environment for the last 18 to 24 months. And that has also directionally led to a shift towards, not for the lack of a better word, slightly riskier assets, whether you want to call it equities or alternates. And thirdly, I think generally speaking, with the newer wealth coming in, awareness is much more. So I think all these 3 things to a certain extent have led to much higher flows, generally speaking, in the industry. And obviously, the fact that returns have been consistent and less volatile have helped to the growth kind of proportionately. So overall, I think the macros have really supported well. And fortunately, from a business perspective, companies have also done well. So I think overall, the environment has been fairly supportive during this entire COVID phase. And honestly, it may end up setting up a good platform for time to come.
Right.
I think Karan summed up in terms of the overall investment climate. But I think outside of the investment climate, I mean, a couple of interesting things. Wealth management per se is a very high physical touch model, right? I mean, we never thought as an industry, there would be days that we will all be meeting virtually, not just this panel, but even with clients. But I think so that the overall industry dealt with the whole thing very maturely. I think clients were okay with the new form of dispensation of the advice meted out. But I think also one other thing is a couple of asset classes, I think, got catapulted and parachuted because of, I think, the onslaught of COVID. One, because of the overall digital revolution, I think we are seeing far more low friction, low cost products coming out. I think for all you know, this might end up being a catalyst moment for ETFs and passives in India, because the more usage of technology that will be there, the more usage of low friction products is going to be there. So I think we might see that as a big sort of asset class creation. International investing, I think most of us on the call have been champions of diversifying across geographies for a very long time. But I think everything has to have its own time. And only this time is when investors, advisors, wealth managers alike have come to this conclusion that yes, while many of us went into COVID and it was a sort of a global issue, but getting out is going to be very decoupled. So diversification is going to be a theme, which I think is going to be here to stay. I think your AMC, Naveen, has done quite an astounding job. I think we are now seeing many of them follow suit. So passives, ETFs, international, and of course, what happened yesterday with the Zomato listing is also, to my mind, about a year or two advancement. Had COVID not happened, who knows how this space would have played out. I mean, the space had to play out, but whether we preponed that a bit, time to, jury is still out. But I think some of those asset classes, which maybe 2 years ago were not the top of the mind asset classes for investors, are now very potent asset classes also to consider. So I think those are some of the changes in addition to what Karan mentioned in the overall investment climate per se.
Sure, we're going to deep dive into that, the trends like passive, the trends like alternates. Himanshu, you want to come in terms of what changes you've seen or what changes you forecast because of this?
So one, I would say, Naveen, COVID has actually made the world closer and far more productive and efficient. We are meeting all today on this platform. 1 hour, we are done. Otherwise, to do this kind of a meeting, maybe one needs to spend half a day or a full day to travel. Second, I would say, especially related to wealth industry, initially it came as a shock in March 2020, but within a couple of days, we all got geared up. And you know how the volatility was in March 2020. Markets came down by almost 1/3. And then from there, it has moved up by 100%. So volatility has been there, but everyone has become very, very productive. Today, an average RM is working 10 to 12 hours a day and is spending so much of quality time in terms of advising rightly on their clients. So I would say from the wealth industry point of view, it's a blessing in disguise. No doubt there was a health issue, there was a health hazard, once in a century kind of an event. But the way industry has come together, in fact, all wealth managers today, rather than competing, they have become friends also. And they have started discussing with each other how to take things forward. So I would say thanks to this wealth industry, because everyone has started thinking more about their clients, how to add value to them. And that is something which is a big shift which has happened in the wealth management mindset today. And that is something which will set the base for next 10, 20 years. So I think all of us, Ashish, Shrikant, Karan, Vijay, myself, same goes for you and Akhil also. We are at the right place at the right time. Hopefully this COVID is behind us soon. And then we are able to gear up for the next inflection point now from here.
Absolutely. Vijay, you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks, Naveen. Yeah, thanks, Akhil. Thanks to the Motilal team for having me on the show. Very good afternoon to all the panelists as well. Of course, to all the viewers. I think we've had a great round of points raised before I came in. To me, business has really, in a way, got fast forward. Maybe 3-4 years of what we were doing, what we were expecting to happen, I think in a way has probably just gotten accelerated today with more and more people coming, more and more people getting into digital ways of embracing digital behavior. So that's the kind of shift we are seeing, and it's all getting reflected in the growth momentum that one is witnessing in the industry.
Right. Ashish?
Yeah, so I think quite a few points have been covered by the other panelists, but central banks have really played Santa Claus, I would say, for the entire financial services industry. A lot of liquidity has come in. So there are 2-3 observations over the last 1 year. One, I think the operating model itself is undergoing as we speak. I think when we look back 5 years from now, we would have realized that this was a turning point in the way we operate. I don't think even once things open up, this figital way of operating will go away. So like some of my people said, things have become far more efficient. You're able to get in more hours with clients. At the same time, there are serious challenges as well. I mean, there are so many relationship managers we've onboarded digitally. I mean, they've not even seen the office. We've done the entire induction digitally. So I think the human aspect of it, how it will evolve, will be a challenge, I guess, for most business managers. The other thing is, I've also realized during COVID, clients are dedicating more time to their portfolios. There is a lot of need for, from their end, get involved more actively. So we've seen people moving from managed portfolios to direct equities, or even in managed portfolios, there is a much greater involvement from the family in terms of what's happening. So that obviously is a challenge for the wealth manager, and he needs to rise to that. I think the other point which is very common is money is moving to riskier assets as yields are lower than even inflation today. And that's, I think, a solution that most clients will look forward to from wealth managers going forward. So I think the operating model is my biggest takeaway for the wealth management business. It's evolving very, very fast as we go forward.
Yeah. So good afternoon, everyone, and we'll try and deep dive now into some of the nitty-gritties of various asset classes. And as a warm-up, my question is directed towards Vijay and Himanshu. Obviously, you know that in the last 18 months, we have seen that the interest rates have been going down, the fixed income yields have been moving down. And alongside, we also know that Indian investors have been under-allocated towards equities. So this trend seems to be changing with more and more people now taking interest into equities, taking slightly higher risk for that higher return. But since you come from the respective business, ICICI Securities and Himanshu, of course, talking to a lot of large clients, what are you seeing in terms of trends changing, investors taking more interest? Sorry, I think there was some technical issue. But yeah, I think largely, do you see in the last 12, 18 months, investors talking more about equities, taking more interest? It's just a warm-up question. What are your thoughts on this?
Vijay, you want to go first?
Yeah, okay. Like I mentioned, there has been a fast forwarding. There's been a fast forwarding of what probably would have taken 3-4 years maybe to happen in the Indian markets is getting front loaded. We've had a globally Robinhood sort of impact with which started off in the US. Very similar trends we've seen in India, and overall, we are seeing that the environment is very sort of supportive towards equities, which is in a way the access, the investment sort of opportunity today, the benign interest rate scenario, which is a competing sort of an allocation that we would do. At least some time back, some tepid performance from the fund industry, all these which are, in a sense, competing sector has sort of propelled more money into direct equities. And, the fact that we've always felt that India is underpenetrated and it is waiting to happen. I think probably we are at an early stage of that waiting to happen, actually beginning to happen. So that's the kind of play out which seems to be happening just now. Again, when you look at retail participation as a percentage in the houses on a daily basis, you're seeing more and more sort of percentage of money getting allocated on a daily basis by equity investors. So indeed, right now the retail interest is very, very high.
Certainly. Himanshu?
Yeah, so Akhil, your question was around fixed income and money moving into equities. Now, one of the biggest things which we have observed is the mindset of people. Earlier people used to have money for long term, but their thinking was short term. So if it could be a 20, 30, 40 years money, they will always think about 3 to 5 years. Today, that mindset has changed. And that coupled with fixed income today, if you today in a fixed income, decent quality papers can compound your money at 6%. One, you are hardly able to beat inflation on a post-tax basis. So real rate of return is not coming in fixed income. And if you have to double your money, it will take 12 years to double your money at 6% compounded. Similarly, if you give 12 years, equities, if they grow at 14% per annum, they can make it 4.5 to 5 times. That kind of a return, they can compound it. So if people are thinking today of 10 years, 15 years, they say might as well go through the volatility, but can compound the money at 4.5 to 5 times or even if one standard deviation is applied, it can make it 3 to 7 times. Or even if 2 standard deviations are applied, it can be 2 to 10 times. So I have a potential of fixed income making it double. Over here, I can on an average go up to 5 times, but the range could be 2 to 10 times. So that long-term shift thought process has actually changed the trends. And that is where you see today very sophisticated clients, which we call as family offices. Their allocation towards volatile asset classes is increasing, whether it is equities or alternate asset classes. That is going up. And that is what all the data is also being shown over wherever you see. And fixed income as a percentage is coming down because of the sheer change in mindset of people.
Sure. India has traditionally been a very, alpha-seeking market, and the markets have also provided that alpha to investors. Karan, do you see this change to passive, and how do you see it? How big do you see it? Globally, obviously, it's become a force to reckon with. How do you see this playing out in India?
So I think, Naveen, different clients will do it differently. I don't think so. It's going to be a binary kind of approach. I think on large cap and on fixed income largely, there will be a trend towards passive and maybe also international equities, because the ability to easily generate alpha will not be there. So I think where the allocation come into these 3 categories, like we've seen a large success in the form of Bharat Bond ETF or even the SDL hold to maturity kind of mutual funds, where the expense ratios fall dramatically and make a tangible difference to the return. Similarly, on the large cap side, I think people will find it much easier to maybe allocate to passives rather than invest into 4-5 funds and arrive at a average return which is broadly equal to passive. So I think from a portfolio construct perspective, there will be a certain segments which will move into passive, but overall, I think there will be, for the lack of a better word, there will be a satellite component of every portfolio, which will either find its way to maybe multi-cap PMSs, which have the ability to be a little more concentrated than a large cap mutual fund, or at the very extreme mid-capish kind of closed-ended AIF, or also even to a small extent alternates which can generate alpha but come with the compromise of a lot of illiquidity. So I think overall, it's going to be difficult to define the right percentage, but I think passives both on debt and equity for a large high net worth individual might range between the 25 to 40% level eventually. And as you go down the value chain, I think for retail investors, it might end up being a slightly larger portion. So that's really the way I would look at it. But I think alpha generating ideas across the spectrum will always continue to have a lot of interest from high net worth individuals.
Sure. Shrikant, you spoke about this as well in your opening remarks in terms of the rising role of passive. You want to elaborate on that a little bit more?
I broadly agree with the assessment that Karan made. I mean, that I think a lot is being spoken about whether passives will sort of eat active for lunch. I don't think that's really the case. It will have to complement. And even in the more developed parts of the market, it's not either or. I mean, the space that was vacated by actives were taken in by hedge funds and alternative funds. So I think as long as active managers continue to perform and give the required alpha that they are expected to, I think both will have space. And I think the point is well made that areas which do not have potential to deliver very significant incremental returns over periods of time will obviously be up for grabs. It's very easy to execute. It's extremely low on cost. There usually are no exit loads. So the writing is on the wall that unless and until there is incremental returns, some of the macro shifts of next year, Naveen, most likely your panel will not look like this. Your panel will have 2-3 fintech company wealth managers sitting on top. So I think those changes will also going to push how some of the ecosystems going to change, right? So I think passives are here to stay. We ourselves currently have a 1/3 allocation to passives, but I think I would broadly agree to what Karan mentioned. Our 1/3 allocation is largely on the fixed income side of the portfolio, which otherwise would have been the hold to maturity category, or on the large cap slight amount of multi-cap. But I think the mid-cap, thematic, alpha-generating ideas, there is still reasonable value to be ascribed to by managers like yourselves and others in the market. I think that space will be here to stay.
So Naveen, if I may jump in here, I just thought, I'll add a little bit of a color more from a fund house point of view. Last 1 year, we've seen, overall the industry grow quite smartly. About a year ago, passives used to constitute just about 7% or thereabouts of the total net AUM. 1 year down, today it's in the ballpark of about 10%. Next 3-4 years, I would believe, and I would quite agree with the views expressed, that there is going to be probably growth in both the industries. I think particularly given both the sides of the industry, particularly given the point at which India is today. So many more issuances are coming into the market. There is scope for alpha generation ideas which will not be captured by the passives. So there is a scope, certainly a scope for growth. So growth is certainly going to be there across. But perhaps next few years, the pace of growth in the passives would far outweigh. Some of the challenges that passives have been facing, I think, are gradually getting addressed. The fintech point that was made, more and more innovation around that space is clearly beginning to happen, which is going to probably drive growth in this industry. Education is improving, customer awareness, investor awareness is improving. More tools are coming, digital tools are coming to just simply make it easier for investors to understand, access, and allocate money there. So lots of stuff is happening as we speak. So next few years, from a fund house perspective, I think one should put a sharp focus on that, because otherwise there'll be a left out fee.
Sure. Right. So this question.
Sorry, if I can just quickly make a rejoinder to that. I think a lot is made on passives as being oversimplistic. I think that's just one part of it, right? I mean, we talk of passive and we speak of Nifty, or we speak of a gold bees, or we speak of a Bharat bond, I think, which is fair. But two recent products, one on the low vol side, one on the momentum side, are clear indicators that in India, and we've seen across many, many aspects, not just in the world of investments, but across that, when we catch up with something, we have a tendency to leapfrog and catch. So not only will we have passives in the form of simple ETFs, but we will also have what we call as smart beta ETFs. And there is a lot of study that is being made that even the incremental returns that can be generated using smart beta ETFs sometimes might even go beyond and push the envelope and stake a claim to what today is a space that you don't normally associate them with. So I think passives alone should not be relegated to an oversimplified asset class. I think there's potential there as well. I think that's the part that we all, in the asset management side, in the wealth advice distribution side, should all be cognizant and see how do we give investors an experience where we can give an experience of superior returns, lower volatility, and do not be close to any idea and look at all options available and make that seamless experience to the investor.
That's a great point, Shrikant. I totally agree. That's how we're thinking about this whole proposition.
Yeah. So my next question is actually moving on from your investors to your manufacturing investment partners. So would like to hear from you, Ashish, Himanshu, Karan, Shrikant, all of you actually. What are some of the key factors you look into before deciding on to which manufacturing partner you want to partner with for variety of products? So what are some of the things which go in to shortlist your investment partners? Ashish, maybe you can start.
Yeah, so I think once you decide which asset class you want to partner in, you first look for whether the partner has an edge in that asset class. Today, there's the rise of alternatives, and there are people who are specialized in startups. There are people who are specialized in private equity. Similarly, when it comes to asset allocation within equities, I mean, we just spoke about passives as well as smart beta, right? So the portfolio will also get sharply divided, I guess, in the future between index and alpha. So even there, I think you will have to look for managers who are clearly alpha oriented and differentiated. Second thing which is very important from our point of view is the longevity of partnerships. What happens, I've always noticed in a bull market, there are many people who start up an investment business, right? And it's only in a tough market you realize people who are here for the longer run. So if you're looking for a partnership, serious partnership, you want to partner with institutions or partners who are here in it for the long run. And the third point, which we've been constantly stressing for investors as well, it's not just about the near-term returns, but about a philosophy. I mean, can you partner with investment managers who have different philosophies, but at the same time are consistent in the application of their philosophy? So you can't expect every investment manager to deliver superior alpha all the time. So if you have a partnership with maybe 5, 6 investment managers in every asset class, and these investment managers are clearly differentiated in terms of the style, approach, and are consistent in applying that style, I think that's what you look for. And of course, the softer aspects of uh, whether the partnership can result in certain bespoke ideas for clients. Can the partnership result in value addition from an engagement point of view? So I guess these are the primary factors that I guess we would look for when
I think
we.
Ashish, you have also created the 4C framework, right?
Yeah.
So that's compliance. Maybe in a line you want to explain that.
No, the number one is clarity of philosophy. So whenever we go in and evaluate an investment manager, the first thing we look for is how the philosophy has been applied for over years and how it has evolved. And then, of course, we look at consistency of performance as over near term 1-3 years. And I think there is a slide which has been doing the rounds in the industry, and we update it every quarter. And it's very clear that the top 25 in terms of ranks funds, they tend to underperform in the subsequent 3 years. I mean, this mean reversion is a very, very powerful concept. So I think these are a few of the things that we keep evaluating and educating our customers as well on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, we'll talk on the mean reversion part. Karan, maybe you want to make few points.
No, so I think for us, I think consistency is the most important. And we typically see clients being able to hold on for a longer time period only if returns are broadly consistent, because volatility never really helps. So even a great manager who's at periods of up and down may not end up being the best partner, because clients may not end up surviving the entire journey. So for us, I think consistency is a big point. Second, I think senior management involvement and commitment to the partnership is very important for us, because a lot of things around compliance, innovation, ability to come up with new ideas, deal with unknown variables. All of that kind of gets packaged into finally commitment to the relationship, and that can only happen if the right set of people within the firm are kind of engaged. And third, I think performance mean reversion is extremely important, but we found it extremely difficult to kind of be able to assess performance on a very consistent periodic basis. So I think that's important, but as long as we are in the top 25%, top 30% quartile, we are broadly good to go. And consistency for us therefore becomes a little bit more important, and maybe having a good relationship with the top management is very critical for us.
Yeah, so I think in extension to what Karan and Ashish both made points on mean reversion, I think great managers who have, who practice their philosophy, their processes, these managers also go through their own cycles of performances, great performances, and then, underperformances. And Ashish, I think you made a recent presentation where on every 3-year block, the top performing funds usually in the following 3 years tend to become quartile 4 funds. So I thought that Himanshu, maybe you can share some of your thoughts. Srikanth, how do you back some of your partners when they go through their cycles of underperformance?
So, Akhil, to what Ashish and Karan have already spoken, I would say, first of all, we look at broadly 5 parameters. Number 1, corporate governance. Can you trust the brand you are giving your money? Do they stick to their stated objectives? Do they do all things which are very, very clean? So corporate governance is number 1. Second, of course, consistency of performance, track record, and the capability of the fund management team, which is very, very important. Third parameter, which is exceedingly important, and we have started giving weightage to it, is how much is the skin in the game of the fund management team. A lot of times we have seen various fund management outfits or wealth managers, they give something different to their clients what they subscribe to. While we believe, if Naveen, you visit my home, whatever food I serve you, I would like to eat the same. Same goes in our investment philosophy. Whatever we serve to our clients, we should also eat. So skin in the game is exceedingly important. And yes, for any relationship to flourish, relationship skills, whether it is with the relationship manager or with the top management, that is exceedingly important because that makes 1 + 1 higher than 2. And fifth, most hygiene factors, whether it is around servicing issues, updation issues, technology back support, or the operational support. So these are some of the areas which we focus a lot. And yes, when you do consistency and you follow concepts like rebalancing, reallocation, those helps you to evaluate those managers. We have followed this mean reversion policy. We in fact invented this reallocation model called as STARS way back in 2004. And that's a very time-tested model. It reduces the standard deviation of any portfolio between 20 to 35% and improves the compounded returns by 2 to 4% per annum. So it works on both sides. Rebalancing only reduces the standard deviation, but it also brings in an additional alpha. So rebalancing is something which is very, very close to our heart. In fact, we went ahead on a step called as reallocation, which is a very, very powerful concept. And last, I would say from 2004 till 2021, 17 years, nothing has done better than that. Because I have spent now many years in this industry. Relationship managers also get carried away with the markets, sometimes greed, sometimes fear. And the only way to control those emotions is work on absolutely boring science-related models, which are very, very pure Excel-driven. And that is what reallocation is all about.
Absolutely. Srikanth?
I think we obviously have our own proprietary 3-tier model. We've been using that for about 15, 20 years now. But I think it also, for a minute, if I step back, a little bit on philosophy, right? So the way we generally slot most of our counterparties is it part of our core holdings or is it part of our satellite? And core or satellite is not passing a value judgment on whether it's good or bad. Essentially, core is something that is an all-weather hold. It's a hop-on, hop-off. You don't need to specifically define an exit unless, of course, as Himanshu mentioned, someone deviates from the stated objectives. But generally, a core manager is supposed to be one who is relevant in all market conditions, all market cycles. And satellite is usually our counterparties for us who are contextual for that market conditions. So, which I think most of us end up making the mistake when we onboard a satellite manager and do not define an exit window, and it ends up becoming a core, and it usually ends up giving a zero-sum approach. So it starts with philosophy. Once the philosophy is very clearly identified, it goes through the rigor of our 3-tier approach. The first tier is purely on quant. I think Himanshu echoed a lot of that. The quant is largely to do with risk than to do with return. Return is very easy, but the overall concept of risk-adjusted return is of paramount importance. Second is to do a lot on qualitative parameters. And the third is also what some of my other panelists mentioned, is the senior management comfort, both within Kotak and what one sort of hears on the ground. those three attributes goes towards finalizing which instrument, product, AMC that one sort of works with. But I think two things that have become much more important than these. I think all of us have got our own standard way of evaluating funds. For us, two things, I think Himanshu mentioned it, but I'll just maybe take a slightly deeper look at it. We've now started taking an approach of saying that if there is no system or operational compatibility, however good the fund is, we may sort of step aside, because in today's day and age, if I'm not able to give MIS on the first or the second or the third in a digital age, I'm okay. I'm okay giving an investor 0.5%, 1/4% lower return, but stick with consistent partners who are able to give us MIS on time, on the go. Excel sheet MISs are thing of the past. Error-prone MISs are thing of the past. So how robust is the system compatibility is extremely crucial. As many of you would know, we also run a very robust advisory platform where some of our role transcends into not just the part of the monies that we manage, but to play a slightly more aggregated role. So unless and until we are able to give investors aggregation across channel partners, it's usually of no use. And last, and I think Naveen and we have had chats in the past as well, we are also equally cognizant of how important is sustainability as a concept. In fact, our due diligence questionnaires now carry ESG scoring. We ourselves are subscribed to Sustainalytics. We've not yet started using that as an elimination criteria, but we've started building the blocks where we have started using the sustainability scoring for wherever possible. Of course, we also understand that it's a little data scarce, but these are things that you can't escape anymore. So for us, ESG scoring is also slightly more relevant.
Sure. Digital businesses globally are at the forefront of all wealth creation, a lot of the wealth creation. And in India, this was hitherto, restricted to, you can say, the global funds and relatively limited participation of the Indian family offices or wealthy people. That is now changing. I think both Karan, Shrikant, you have recently raised sizable corpus on this front. Expectations are obviously running high. Evaluations are running high globally, right? How do you see this whole thing playing out? Because on one hand, there may be risks associated with this. On the other hand, there are obviously phenomenal returns that these things are, delivering, at least for the last 5-7 years globally. Even in India, for some of the global funds. Maybe Karan, you want to come in, and Shrikant, you can share your recent perspectives also on this.
Thanks, Naveen. I think are you referring to the technology?
Yes, the pre-IPO, the technology, the digital.
Yeah. No, so I think from our perspective, I think and Naveen, as much as you and me both know, I think we're not able to necessarily always collect all the right money at the right time, right? But it's our job to ensure that when we collect large amounts of money, the investments are sustainable and last through multiple cycles. Okay, I think so. That's going to be important. I don't think so. Late stage tech right now is going to go through one cycle only, which is going to be up and up. Eventually, I think we will get there, but we may end up seeing a cycle over the next 3 to 4 years where we see a bit of pain. So I think we have to be prepared for that, and we have to have that kind of back-end thought process while we decide on the quality of our investments. I think if we can get that, and even if you look at our earlier opportunities of 2018-19, it's not as if returns have come one way. It's been through a cycle, and especially when you're looking at things like pre-IPO or unlisted strategies. During that period of volatility, things can look really tough because it becomes illiquid. But I think eventually you'll get there, but you have to be mentally prepared to ensure that you do investments with a perspective of ensuring capital conservation, even though you might end up maybe sacrificing 3-4% or 5% returns. So the quality of the businesses you buy right now will become extremely critical because the valuations are fairly rich. So I think there will be some balancing aspects to the entire strategy. We'll have to be fairly careful as we build out the strategies in these lines to ensure that we don't kind of overcross ourselves.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What are your risk filters, Shrikant? Shrikant, you're on mute.
Sorry, as I couldn't agree more. I think it was almost incumbent on many of us to give the Indian HNIs a ride in what is no longer just a momentum trade. It's no longer just a fad trade, but business models have clearly pivoted, right, to embracing new technology. So I think it's here to stay. Yes, one may argue that the valuations are higher, and I don't think anyone will be able to successfully argue that every company which is valued at multiples of $1 billion are all very well justified. But the fact is, that's exactly how globally some of these technology companies have got their valuations, right? Because what one needs to understand is many of these companies do not follow a linear approach of growth. Most of them follow an exponential approach of growth. And we've had very interesting conversations with fund managers, because we're also now looking at listed fund managers. How are they going to evaluate? So far, it was all okay when wealth managers, investors, asset managers, they were all on the sidelines, slightly sometimes cynical, slightly sometimes having the fear of missing out. But now here it's a brute reality. Zomato has hit public markets. Paytm is going to follow suit. Some of them are going to find their way into the index. This is exactly how it happened in China, how it happened in US. So 2 years later, 3 years later, the composition of Indian index might look very different. So I think it's here to stay. Some of them may go through the ups and downs of valuation mismatch, but overall, to discount the fact that technology is not going to play a strong role is not right. So I think we also, the successful fundraise that we've had also was a part of the latent demand that was out there. So it was not just that it just happened to be right place, right time. And according to us, it's at least the next 2-3 years is going to see many more of these opportunities for Indian investors before finally it settles into a category of its own.
Himanshu, you have some thoughts on this as well?
Sorry, on the pre-IPO or late tech stage investments?
Yeah.
So again, I would say, Naveen, interest rates are really low. Difficult to get real rate of returns from fixed income. Equities will increase volatility. So there are a couple of things which clients will have to do without increasing volatility substantially, is to get into alternate space. So alternate space is something which will definitely create more opportunities. Digitalization, which is primarily available in unlisted space. Because today, 80% of the companies, which are about $500 million, are available in the private space. And if one has to get in over there with a slightly different correlation, one will have to go over there in the unlisted space. Similarly, venture debt as an asset class is also picking up very well over there. So one is also saying, okay, fine, taking slightly higher risk than the debt, I can get some real rate of returns from that asset class. So these things, I would say asset allocation, especially when we talk about ultra high net worth and family offices, COVID times have given them actually thinking to go back to the drawing board and say, okay, fine, if we have to really create real rate of return, what kind of an asset allocation will drive us as we go forward? And for that, even the thinking, what I raised first point, is thinking has become very long term compared to what they used to think 3 to 5 years. Now, no one talks less than 10 years for their long-term portfolios.
Right. So coming to you, Vijay, I think, during the pandemic times, obviously we have seen a huge influx of retail investors getting into direct equities. I think record number of demat accounts getting opened and a lot of activities by retail investors on their own. How do you see this whole thing emerging? Will the trend continue? More and more participation will increase. And do you see that domestic investors or retail investors will be the potential hedge for any kind of FII outflows in any kind of eventuality. Let's say 2013 we had the taper tantrum. Maybe this time retail investors might give you that that protection. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, tough to conclude the second part, but let me share with you how we've started thinking about this whole influx of people. And many people have been asking this question, whether this is one-off, whether it will continue, what's really propelling. And I think there is enough narrative around it, right? There has been a big growth in the Demat accounts that you spoke about on the back of digital access, very convenient ways of doing business, valuations of equities, which itself is mouth-watering, tepid interest rate scenario, all of that was very conducive. And that probably started off that first wave. One was thinking about it as to whether this wave is going to abate. Naturally, one thought that, when something abnormal happens, there is going to be a kind of a phase after which things start abating. We are still waiting. The abatement has not started. And one has started thinking about, what really is happening here, and are we in for any kind of a structural change that's taking place. And here is a hypothesis that's building in, which I thought I'll share. Given the fact that, the retail investor interest seems to be continuing, even with greater force, one was looking at, the population profile that's coming into the markets. And we find a very, very large proportion of people who are coming into the account, starting off their new relationships, majority of them actually, happen to belong to the below 25-year age profile, let alone, 25 to 30. They are below 25. That's a little bit of an eye-opener. And we were actually thinking about, what really is happening. And one way to think about it is that, the people, the investors or the individuals born after 90s, as compared to the senior millennials, guys who were born probably in the 80s, there is a little bit of a difference. The 90s born is a digital native. 80s born is very tech savvy, and there's a difference between a digital native and a tech savvy guy. And this digital native, literally born with a mobile phone in his hand, very used to living inside that phone. His world is different. He's inspired differently. He's motivated differently. His buying, construct is very different. And unless you belong to him in his world, you're irrelevant. And given the fact that, the new age access points into the markets belong to his world, they have, in a way, captured his imagination. And at what I figured out is that close to about 1.5 crore Indians have turned 25 in 2020. 2021, another 1.5 crore Indians are turning 25. And 2022, another 1.5 crore Indians. And 2023, another 1.5 crore Indians. And the story goes on for the next 10 years. So it looks like these digital natives are coming like a tidal wave into the system. And many of them naturally sort of, from a mindset perspective, also aligned towards financial investments. They look for digital ways of putting their money to use, including into cryptos. You're seeing and reading a lot about money flows there. So it's not just Indian capital markets, but also cryptos, overseas investments, and so on and so forth. So there is this kind of a narrative which is getting constructed as to whether indeed it is a structural change and the story is going to continue. Now, your second part, whether this whole story is going to replace the FIIs, too early to say, because I think it's going to take a few years before they're large in numbers, but they're still not, the shakers and movers of the quantum. So I think it's going to take a little bit of while. They go through a maturity phase. There's going to be still that, experience of facing a downturn and then still coming back strong. They've got to still face that all. So it's to be seen. I think it's still early days for that. But more people into the markets, I think augurs very well for the industry, for the country, because whether it is in equities, whether it is, it's going to be in the world of investment, whether it's mutual funds, equities, somewhere or the other, and they'll toggle between one and the other. So I think that's the kind of move that probably recent times have triggered.
I think amazing answer, Vijay. I think a lot of insights, a lot of data points. Thank you so much for that. In fact, I tracked this data, may not be too accurate, but a couple of years back, 24% of our total market cap used to be FIIs. And roughly 14-15% is the retail participation. Rest all is the promoter. So while the FII market cap contribution has come down from 24 to 20%, retail is still intact at 14%. And we do hope that this 14-15% can go up to 20 sooner than later. So let's hope for that. Ashish, you may want to come in and share your experiences.
Yeah, so I mean, on the stocks bit, clearly, I mean, we've seen a preference of not just younger investors, but even amongst family offices, HNIs, ultra HNIs, there is a trend towards building a portfolio themselves, because the pandemic has accelerated digitization. The pandemic has also given a lot of time to people to ponder over their portfolios and how it is to be constructed. I think the other trend which will also emerge apart from passivization is for large caps, and wherever the alpha is missing, people may actually do it themselves directly. I mean, they don't want an active fund manager to be buying an HDFC Bank or an Infosys for them. So a lot of clients are migrating towards creating large cap portfolios on their own as well. So you will see both. You will see passives and you will see direct buying of stocks in large caps. This is a trend I think we are going to see accelerating. And like I said in the beginning, digital is going to be the new reality going forward. Even once things open up, I think people have realized that this is way more efficient than actually traveling and doing physical meetings. I mean, you can actually sit out of your room today and do meetings in 4 cities in India, which was just impossible a year and a half back. So I think Figital is the new word. So people will do relationship meetings physically, but execution, portfolio reviews, any intellectual conversation that you want to have with data points, etc., it's best done on Zoom. So this trend is only going to accelerate. And like most people on the panel have said, basically, COVID has been a different moment for digitization. It's accelerated this journey almost 3-4 years, even for the financial services industry.
Right. Thanks so much. So Karan, Srikanth, Himanshu, bringing you back again. So basically, we are seeing a lot of corporatization in the family-run businesses or family-owned businesses. Since you also manage a lot of large family offices, do you see this corporatization in the family wealth office kind of setups? Any trends, emerging trends you are seeing emerging in the last few quarters? Preferred asset classes? How are they looking at risk? All these kind of things. Maybe Karan, you can start, and then Srikanth, Himanshu, you can add your thoughts.
So I think the one change which we are seeing clearly is the fact that clients are open to doing a little bit of illiquid stuff, and typically private equity and structured credit used to be a much smaller portion of the client's portfolio. But overall, I think the impact of compounding, and especially the impact of compounding on reinvestment, is something clients are able to appreciate, and therefore, they from a family office perspective, apart from doing investments in the normal core stuff like we discussed earlier, I think there is enough appetite for some bit of satellite stuff, and some family offices obviously have the ability and the expertise to be a little bit more adventurous, and also maybe do investments directly in some of these things. We for one have been a little bit more cautious in taking a fund approach, but I think overall clients are comfortable with taking an approach of 5 to 15% in a combination of a little bit of structured credit as well as a little bit of private equity. So I think that's something which is here to stay. And within the listed equity portion also, clients are willing to have a 3 to 5% kind of allocation to a broad, for the lack of a better word, a broad pipe kind of approach, where it's semi-unlisted in that sense. So I think overall 10 to 20%, depending on what kind of client we are talking about and the sophistication of the family office, I think there is a little bit of orientation to take a little bit of illiquid risk. Maybe the market risk is similar to what is there on the listed side.
Absolutely, absolutely. Just want to add one more question before Srikanth you come in. We also have had recently we got the white paper on the accredited investors. Which says that you can have flexibility around large family offices making investments through either the PMS or the AIF route. Post this white paper, have you started thinking how this will whole thing kind of shape up?
No, I think the accredited investors thing is a great change in regulation, and I think it will go a long way in adding flexibility to managing portfolios. I think there are many things there, right from the flexibility of having an AIF with a minimum 70 crores contribution, having a lot of flexibility both in terms of approval as well as in terms of investment construct. But most importantly, if the accreditation comes through, I think the ability to take investors with minimum 25 lakhs and on the PMS side, I think, and most importantly on the AIF side, I think, and even on the advisory side, you can do a lot more stuff compared to what was being planned earlier. So I think overall, and for most of us on this call, 80 to 90% of our investors will be accredited investors. So I think in that sense, it will give us a lot of flexibility, even in terms of fees, counterparty regulations, ability to explain market risk to clients. I think overall it will expand the horizon much more and will give more teeth to licenses like portfolio management, advisory, as well as alternative investment funds. So I see a fairly broad horizontal and vertical impact on all these three businesses with the accredited investor regulation coming through.
Right, agree with you. Srikanth?
No, look, I think you raised a very interesting question on corporatization of family office. I think that's clearly a trend that is very visible. I think most of the family offices now are almost becoming a quasi-institutional player, right? I mean, what used to be delegated as a private client HNI, many of them are taking space which almost resembles close to a quasi-family, quasi-institution kind of a thing. And I think in many anchor books you will see, in many institutional fundraising you will see, it's almost 20, 30, 40% run by family offices. And that's exactly how the trend in some of the Western parts of the world also, or closer home in Singapore, Hong Kong, is also visible. I think it's also, if you see the reason of some of these getting into that space is almost before a year back, we didn't have a clear sort of a regulation covering advisory on its own. I think what has happened in the last 1 year is advisory as a business has clearly been green lighted, and you will now see going forward many of these investors having a very clear shift to what they expect from their wealth manager. And there is not this is not a question of what is right or what is wrong, but I think the era of running commingled business models is clearly getting unraveled. I think some of those will also play its own part of how some of these family offices get structured, because now investors will have an option of either setting up their own family offices, or will have an option of outsourcing family offices to firms providing very clearly identifiable advisory services. And I think on the asset classes that you mentioned, the larger the pool of a family office, the more sophisticated the family office setup is, I think we are clearly seeing them getting more and more interested in asset classes that goes beyond the conventional norm. I think most of them have already been mentioned. And I would only sort of add weight to what Karan said on the question on accredited investor circular. I think that, along with the whole investment advisory regulation, these are progressive steps. These are very clear signs that newer business models, these are clear signs that investors who have minimum net worth of X and above will clearly be under the light touch regime, where your ability to do far more for those investors will give long rope for the investors to get their investment objective, and for intermediaries like all of us on the panel to hopefully do a little bit more than what was hitherto available. So I think these are extremely progressive steps from a regulatory point of view.
Absolutely, Srikanth. Himanshu?
Yes, so I know we are running behind schedule, and to a consultant during an afternoon, you give a chance, they don't want to stop speaking. So I'll be sharp, focused, and only mention few bullet points, which are basically happening with various family offices. So what Shrikant mentioned, they're really becoming semi-institutions. And 5 or 6 trends which are really picking up with them. One is they are really unlocking value in the traditional businesses and investing into new age businesses. Like last year, 12 unicorns came into picture, 1 unicorn every month. And as per the data, next 5 years, 190 unicorns will be born, which are called as Sunicorns today, which means 1 every 10 days. So a lot of business houses are thinking that why not unlock value in the traditional businesses and create a kitty for new age businesses where they can de-risk and compound their money at a better rate. Second trend, which is also happening, is their thinking has become long-term. They're also increasing their allocation from physical assets into financial assets and going more on equity side. So that is something which is happening. And there, I would beg to differ from some of the things which have been said on the passive investments. I think passive investments increased from 7 to 10% because they were marketed as low expense ratios, or maybe 2018 and 2019 because of reclassification, they did well. But if you just see 3 years rolling returns, and there is a lot of data which can say still India will create alpha by active managers like you. Because today of the market capitalization, 6% is only mutual funds, while US is about 25 to 30, Japan is about 35%, where passives have really picked up. I think we still have a long way to go, but a lot of HNIs are looking at AIFs and PMSs to create alpha from their equity portfolios. And that is where the recent circular of SEBI, which is what Shrikant and Karan have already highlighted about, it's a marquee event which has happened. Third, I would say a lot of family offices are thinking about succession planning, and also immigration. One leg is looking at maybe settling outside India, creating a family wealth structure, and also how to ring fence it from proper efficient tax planning point of view, succession planning point of view. So trust structures and family holding structures, they are playing a very, very important role in any HNI's portfolio. Another area which is happening is diversifying beyond India. Even if India is very, very attractive, and Vallabhbhai mentioned about India becoming an asset allocation, and India is very, very attractive, but diversifying beyond India. Just to share our data, like 3 years back, we were 1% in alternate asset classes, which is unlisted space. And we believe this will go between 15 to 20% over a period of time. Today, we are at 4%. In last 3 years, we have become 2.5 times, which means this asset class has grown 10 times. Next 3 years also, we expect to grow at 25% per annum. So which means we'll double. And if it's going to become 15 to 20%, it has the potential to become 8 to 12 times from here itself. And same is the case with LRS window, which has gone from $1 billion to about $14 billion after this government has come into picture. And now today, everyone is thinking, why not create an alternate portfolio outside India, especially with the family offices that is happening. So these are some of the trends which are shaping up in family offices, and models are getting aligned to cater to this pain, need, whatever you may call, for an HNI. And anyone who is able to address this, I think will flourish and grow with them.
Thank you so much, Himanshu. So we'll make this as a last question, and Naveen, maybe you.
Yeah, basically, in terms of the best practices that you observe, globally, or things that you have brought in or wish to bring in, maybe Vijay and Ashish, and then I'd like to pose this to all of you. If you can share a couple of thoughts, each one of you, we'd love to hear that.
I think, Naveen, what we have learned over the last few years is that investing is more behavioral than not. So the biggest challenge that is in front of us is how do you control the behavior of the investor and how do you control the behavior of the wealth manager? Because both have a tendency of getting carried away. So we had introduced, all the wealth firms have this concept in different nomenclatures, but having a predefined investment charter or an IPS statement with the customer at the point of engagement is something that we found goes a long way in terms of retaining the customer and also ensuring that bad decisions are not taken at tough times in the market. Second challenge is a lot of customer. I mean, having said that, this is one of the best practices we are trying to adopt, increasingly gain acceptance from clients as well. But the challenge when you go out there is customers will start a relationship with a product. Right now, the whole endeavor from that starting point, how do you then start engaging across the portfolio and start giving insights and then bring in the IPS at some point in time so that you understand the customer better and then design portfolios which are in line with his temperament more than I mean, we've spoken a lot about investment, spoken a lot about alpha, but 90% of engagement that I have found is very, very behavioral in nature. So if you can create a portfolio which may not generate phenomenal alpha, but which keeps the customer at peace, and the wealth manager has a pleasant conversation, at least in most portfolio reviews, it really increases the chances of retaining customers. So this is one best practice that we are trying to adopt going forward. Second is having a periodicity of engagement, a certain set frequency. As I said, during the pandemic and lockdown, the need of the customer for engagement has shot up. So how do you track that there is a constant frequency of engaging with customers, monitoring it at a business level and ensuring that you're delivering whatever is the house advice consistently across customer is the second best practice that we are trying to adopt and grow over a period of time. So these are two things that come to my mind from a best practice point of view.
Sure. Vijay?
So, one of the things that we are seeing as a need for investors, particularly I'm talking about some of the younger investors who come in, they lack complete knowledge, financial knowledge, but there is still that interest to get into markets. We've created digital, what one calls digital alerts. We call it iAlerts. Before the investor actually makes investments, he is alerted on some of the things that he should be aware before he actually takes the call. Sometimes it could be that the promoter holding in that particular stock is too high. Rather, pledges on promoter side is too high. There are times when there are certain issues flagged off in the audit side, and so on and so forth. So there are algos that we put at the back end so that these things are picked up and nudged to customers. And we do find behavior changes taking place on account of that. On the back of these alerts, people actually prevent themselves from going ahead with those. Because at the end of the day, we believe that it's about the investor well-being. On the other side, one of the things that we have also seen on the wealth side, we've seen that the need for increasing the review of portfolios has gone up. So that has been sort of shortened, the life cycle of that has been shortened. And our approach there is actually looking at it from a macro as to what should be the sort of macro based on the macro trends, what parts of the markets will do well, and then marrying it with the micro. So that's something that we find goes down pretty well with investor. He's able to relate to those kind of conversations well, and then the over a period of time morph him to what one would call as a model portfolio. So we have a model portfolio, and we sort of demonstrate track record there, and we find that people like to align themselves to that model portfolio. So these are some of the things that we've taught in recent times.
If I may just add here, Naveen, the other thing is that more and more clients, especially the larger ones, want customization. They're very clear that we don't want to adopt a model, or we don't want a one size fit all kind of a portfolio. So there is a greater need for the wealth manager to understand the specific nuances of a family customer and then tailor make the portfolio to suit their needs. I'm sure tech will help us do this faster in a more efficient manner going forward. But this is another need which is clearly emerging, that every customer wants to be treated very differently. And larger the portfolio, there is a lot of need for customization.
Yeah, I completely agree, Ashish. It is tailor-made, it is bespoke, it is customized. But you have a framework which just makes it simpler for the customer to think about it. He finally takes his own calls, but it helps.
Absolutely.
Shrikant?
No, I think from our international point of view, some of the best practices that we see very clearly sort of getting adopted in India. One, I think the whole concept of home country bias, right? I mean, we in India have been very inward looking. Many times for the right reasons, we've been rewarded well. But I think that's something that if you go and look at any of the international investors, the concept of diversification is almost as deeply embedded as the concept of asset class diversification is. So you wouldn't see a New York investor or a London investor or a Hong Kong investor put 100% of the money in their own country or in their own currency. So I think diversification across geographies and currency is almost a given as far as international. And I think that is something that we are seeing that getting changed even in India. Second, I think products are growing horizontally. Otherwise, we about half a decade ago had only a clutch of products that were available through the mutual fund route or through the PMS route. I think that is also coming to an understanding that no product is good or bad. Every product is suitable or not. And that consciousness is obviously coming to investors, be it through the AIFs, be it through venture debt. That's the second critical part. And very small, but a very growing percentage of investors are also very aware investors, that whether it is the topic of sustainability, whether it's the topic of creating long-term capital, but they very clearly know what is required, rather than maybe a decade ago when many of us were still in this trade. Investors literally took what was offered, but I think we are now looking at investors who are far more aware. And last, which I think is also something which has become very important, is establishing the right architecture with their wealth manager is also an important part of how investors have learned to at least start the whole process of wealth creation. Now, whether all you need is access to different products, all you need is access to different ideas, whether you need someone to run an overall advisory for you. So those are very clearly visible trends in addition to all the other things that we've spoken. But I think those 3-4 trends we're seeing very critical, and we are obviously all working towards that.
Sure. Himanshu?
So I would say some of the best practices which are practiced globally, and in India also they are becoming prevalent, but still some homework needs to happen. One is the approach needs to be very holistic. It needs to be service driven or asset allocation driven rather than product driven. Second, one of the key challenges for the industry is it has to be conflict free. So if you manufacture, do you also advise or vice versa? That is one of the finest practices. Some of the global regulators have looked at it, where they say if you are an advisor, you don't need to get into manufacturing capabilities. And at some point in time, I think our regulators should also look at that approach. Then some of the clients, their needs are around confidentiality, continuity of relationships, and does my advisors really care for me? So when March 2020 happened, were they really sitting next to me, even on virtual meetings like this? Now, those are some of the things which are extremely important for taking the profession to the next level. So these are some of the best practices I would like to highlight.
Great. I think we've really overshot our time. Thank you so much, all of you, for taking the time on a Saturday afternoon. We really appreciate this. A lot of insights, data points that some of you shared, best practices. All of them are extremely valuable. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
All the best. Take care.